In this screencast, I'm going to introduce the notion of functions and distinguish between functions and scripts. So let's start with an example. So this is actually a script we've seen before. And so far we've actually dealt with scripts. So these are sets of statements that we entered in this editor window. And scripts can be executed by just pressing the run button, and then it executes the statements line by line. Now scripts are just a handy way to collect a whole bunch of MATLAB commands. We could have also entered these MATLAB commands into the command window, and a script just collects these basically in a text file. Now remember this particular application, the goal here is to convert a percentage score, a numeric score, to a letter grade. So in this example, the user starts with some particular percentage score, let's say it's 40, and then you go through this set of if tests to convert it to the appropriate grade. Now every time the user wants to convert a new score, the user needs to change this value for p-score and then run the program again. And that's certainly one way to set up the code. But it might be more convenient to turn this piece of code into a function, especially if we're using it over and over again for a particular task. So let's do this. So I'm going to make some changes here at the top of this text file to set up as a function. So the goal here, the goal of the function is to take a score, a percentage score as input, convert it to a grade, and then to pass the grade as the output of the function. So functions always have inputs and outputs. So in the syntax here is that I start with the output of the function. So the output of the function is grade. And now I have to give the name of the function. So let's say that my name of the function is grade conversion. This is something that I come up with. And now between parentheses, I have to enter the set of inputs. So in this example, I only have one input, p-score. And I remove this statement over here. So the input is now provided when I call this function. So it expects a single input p-score. And then I run through these commands over here. I have this grade that's being produced and it's passed back as an output. So I have to save this now to some text file. And now let's call this text file the same name as I called the function. So grade conversion. Okay, and this is good convention that the name of this M file, which contains this function, is the same as the name of the function here given here in this first line. So let's see if this function works. Now the goal of this function or the way you use a function is that you can call it from the command window. So I can say, okay, what is the grade that would correspond to a score of, let's say, 70. And I actually have to make some changes here. I have to add these semicolons over here. And now I'm calling again this function. So what is the grade that corresponds to a score of 70? Well, that's C. So what has happened here? So now I can call this function from the command window by this syntax here, where I say on the left hand side, those are the outputs of the function, equal sign, followed by the name of the function, so grade conversion. So that's how we saved it into this M file. And then followed by the set of inputs. In this case, the function expects only one input. So from the command window, I've provided the input 70. And when you run this command, p-score, this variable here, gets assigned to the value 70. So let's see this in action. I can set a breakpoint actually in functions as well as in scripts. And now the execution stops whenever I hit this line over here. So let's call this function again. And now the program has stopped over here. And now I can hover with my cursor over this variable p-score and note that it's been signed to the value 70, right? Because that's how I called it from the command line. And now I can follow the logic of the script and note that it's been assigned to the grade C. And at the end of the line, at the end of this function, the output here is coming back to the command window. So we have this single output grade, and now that's being passed back to the command window, and the value is C. Now let's expand this example. Suppose I would like to not have a single output grade, but I also want to have this score between 0 and 4 to calculate the GPA. And how can I change the syntax here to have two outputs? Well, I have these square brackets, and then I have the list of output variables. So given one by one, you can separate them by commas. So let's say that the second output is called GPA. And how do I calculate the GPA? Well, I have to just expand the code here. So GPA here is 4.0. GPA in this condition is 3.0. Over here it's 2.0, and followed by 1.0, and then for F the GPA is 0.0. Okay, I'm going to save these changes, and now I changed my function, so I have to get two outputs back. Okay, so let's do it like this, and now I'm calling this function to convert the grade of 70 to both a letter grade as well as a GPA number. So now that the program has done this, it gave me back the grade C as well as the GPA of 2. So with functions, you can have multiple outputs as well as multiple inputs. The function always does something on your inputs to create some outputs, and those are passed back, in this case, to the command window where you called the function. Now here's a confusing aspect about functions. And this relates to how you can call your functions with variables that are not necessarily the same as the variables that are used in the function definition over here. So I can actually change this variable over here to a different variable, let's say letter grade, and now the program still works. So now letter grade, the variable letter grade, is assigned to the value C, and note that this is a different name of a variable than what I used in the function definition. So MATLAB actually does not care that you call the function definition with the same names. What it only cares about is that you have the right number of inputs and the right number of outputs. So here I call this function with two outputs, and that matches these two outputs given in this function definition. It does not matter that these names are the same, the names of these variables, that they match the names of these variables. And this can be confusing, this concept. But this is a very important notion of local variables. So what's happening here is that I have some variables that are meaningful here in the command window, and I have some variables that are meaningful here in this local context of this function. So whenever MATLAB calls a function, it just assumes that these variables here are local. So let me give another example to make this distinction clear. So suppose I have a variable called x, and that actually contains my score. So let's say that x is 80. And now I can call my function, let's say with x. Now what happens? Well, I get the correct conversion, my letter grade equals B. So note I call this with the variable x, right? And that does not match this p-score over here, but MATLAB doesn't care about it. So in this case, x has the value 80. And when I call this function, p-score here locally gets the copy of x. So it gets the same value as x and then works with this value locally over here. So let's see this in action. I set a breakpoint over here. I'm again call this function. So I called it with x, and now x gets sort of copied to p-score, and so we see that p-score now is the value 80. So let's give one more example to illustrate this notion of local variables in the function. So let's clear the screen and let's clear all of memory here. Now I'm going to call this function here with the value 70, and I'm going to set a breakpoint over here. So I'm going to call this function with the value 70, and p-score now has been assigned to the value 70, so that's the input that was passed. So I'm stepping through this process over here. Now a grade has been assigned and a GPA has been assigned, and those are the output variables that are then passed back to the place where I called the function from. In this case, that was from the command window. So letter grade is C and GPA is C. Now I'm investigating what variables do I have locally. So I have the variable GPA and letter grade. Now importantly, I do not have the variable p-score in memory. Why? Because that was local to this function. So it only existed in the context of this function. And so it's very important to keep in mind that the variables that can be in memory in the command window are different from the variables used in the context of a function. So let me give one more example of the use of functions. Suppose I have a different way to calculate the mean of a set of numbers, and I create a function for the mean of a set of numbers. And let's say I call this function myMean, and it takes x as an input and y as an output. And let's say that the way I calculate the mean is by saying, well, it's the sum of the values in x divided by the number of entries in x. I'm going to call this myMean. I'm saving it. Now again, I can call this function from the command window. So I can say, so myMean of, let's say, this vector 1, 2, 3, and 4. What is the mean of those numbers? Well, it's 2.5. I will suppress the output here. I'll save this so I can, oops, I should not run this as a script. I should run this over here. And y is now 2.5. In all these examples that I've given so far, I've called the function from the command window. But once you've saved your function in a file, you can call this from other places as well. So you can in fact create a new script where you, let's say, collect some data. So let's say that you have some data 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And now I would like to execute this function that you created, myMean. And now this is a script. Let's give this script a name. And now I'm executing this script. And note that I've called this function that lives in a different window, that lives in a different text file. And I've called this from this particular script. So this is a very useful way to separate different pieces of code. If you have some set of statements that need to be evaluated over and over again, some procedure that you repeat over and over again, then like calculating the mean of a set of numbers or your own calculation procedure, then you can put this in a function and then call this from other parts of your script.